The courthouse was quiet, as it often was on a Wednesday morning. Judge Harold Dawson sat at the bench, his usual air of authority filling the small, aging room. A slight hum of murmurs echoed in the background as the next case was called. A woman stepped forward, Olivia Harris. She was dressed simply, in a modest blazer and dark slacks, her hair pulled back neatly. At first glance, she blended in with the many others who had appeared before the judge. She wasn't out of place, just another person caught in the web of daily life, trying to move through the system. Judge Dawson adjusted his glasses and looked down at the paperwork in front of him. A speeding violation, not uncommon in his court. He glanced briefly at the woman before him, who met his gaze with a calm demeanor that contrasted with the often anxious faces of other defendants. He raised an eyebrow. She seemed composed, even a little too calm for someone facing a ticket. "You were caught speeding in a residential zone," Judge Dawson began, his voice firm. "Do you have anything to say for yourself, Ms. Harris?" Olivia nodded, her expression neutral. "I apologize for the violation, Your Honor. It was an honest mistake. I didn't realize I was exceeding the limit." The judge studied her for a moment. He wasn't easily swayed by excuses, and he hadn't seen her before, but she didn't seem to be a repeat offender. It was a simple case, one that usually ended with a fine. Still, he held his ground, ready to send another motorist on their way with a penalty to pay. "Understood," Dawson replied. "However, speeding is dangerous, and I have to impose a fine. I'm sure you understand the consequences of driving too fast." Olivia nodded again, accepting the decision without protest. She didn't appear flustered, just resigned. She had heard similar speeches in courtrooms before, but she knew this moment wasn't about the ticket itself. It was more about how people like her, those who often went unnoticed, were treated by those in positions of power. Judge Dawson scribbled on the paperwork, sealing her fate with a swift motion. "That'll be a $150 fine," he said, pushing the paperwork forward. Olivia took the paper, nodded politely, and stepped away. She didn't argue, didn't try to explain further, and didn't ask for leniency. The judge assumed she would go on her way just like so many others. Little did he know, the woman standing before him would soon be the one who would change the direction of the city, and his understanding of it. As Olivia Harris left the courtroom, Judge Dawson barely gave her a second thought. To him, she was just another defendant, a person who had made a minor mistake and would pay the price, as many others did. The case had been straightforward. He'd handed down the fine with the same casual authority he had used countless times before. But as the day moved on, Dawson found himself returning to the case in his mind, albeit for only a brief moment. After all, there was nothing remarkable about it. It was just another routine violation, one he had dealt with 100 times. Later that afternoon, Dawson sat in his chambers, reviewing the schedule for the rest of the week. He thought about the traffic cases he'd handled in the morning, mentally cataloging the names, when his colleague, Judge Sarah Mitchell, walked into his office with a stack of files. They began to discuss the day's proceedings. "Any interesting cases today?" Sarah asked casually, flipping through the stack in her hands. Dawson leaned back in his chair, pushing his glasses up his nose. "Not really. The usual, minor speeding, parking violations, that sort of thing." Sarah paused, glancing at him over the rim of her glasses. "Anyone stand out?" Dawson thought for a moment, his mind briefly returning to Olivia Harris, but only briefly. He hadn't noticed anything extraordinary about her. "No," he said, shaking his head. "Just a woman who got caught speeding in a residential zone. Typical mistake. Calm. Didn't make a fuss. I gave her the fine, $150. She didn't seem particularly worried about it." "Well, that's easy enough," Sarah replied, glancing down at the files she was organizing. "At least she didn't make a scene." Judge Dawson nodded, his mind already moving on to the next topic. They discussed the upcoming cases, but in the back of his mind, Olivia Harris's face lingered for a moment. He had seen hundreds of defendants in his courtroom, and most were nervous or defensive, caught up in the pressure of the situation. Harris, however, had been strangely composed. Maybe that was it. Nothing out of the ordinary, just a little too calm for a woman facing a fine. Maybe that was why he didn't give her a second thought. It was the kind of demeanor that seemed to belong to someone who had seen this all before, someone who wasn't rattled by a speeding ticket. But as Dawson moved forward with his day, that was all he thought it was. Nothing more than a regular case. The woman would pay the fine, go on with her life, and he would continue doing his job. There was nothing remarkable about it at all. Or so he thought. Little did he know, the woman he had just found was someone whose presence would soon change the entire town. The next morning, the small town buzzed with an unexpected announcement. The local news flashed across the screens in cafes, on radios, and through social media. Olivia Harris sworn in as the new police chief. Judge Dawson was at his desk, reviewing some files when he caught a glimpse of the headline. He paused, his coffee halfway to his mouth. He rubbed his eyes, blinking in disbelief. He had to read the line again. Olivia Harris, police chief. The surprise was immediate. He quickly opened the article, scrolling through it. Harris wasn't just anyone. She was a decorated officer, well known in law enforcement circles for her leadership and commitment to reform. She had spent years in the force, working her way up through the ranks. It wasn't just a coincidence that her name had been in the news recently. She had been chosen for her experience, vision, and ability to lead. New police chief, sworn in this morning, Olivia Harris is ready to lead the department into a new era of community-focused policing, the article stated. He read on, learning about her past accomplishments and how her appointment was hailed as a groundbreaking moment for the city. Judge Dawson's stomach tightened. His eyes traveled back to his desk, where he had just handed her a speeding fine. The woman he had assumed was just another defendant, a driver who made a minor mistake, was in fact one of the most influential people in the city. He had dismissed her with a simple, almost thoughtless gesture, a fine. And now here she was, the new police chief, someone who would shape the future of law enforcement in the community. He felt a wave of embarrassment wash over him, mingled with a strange sense of curiosity. How could he have missed it? He knew her name wasn't familiar to him, but she had carried herself with such calm authority in court. It wasn't just the case that bothered him now. It was how he had assumed so little about someone without taking the time to truly see them. He had judged her based on nothing more than her appearance and demeanor, without ever knowing who she really was. Dawson shook his head, still trying to process the revelation. It wasn't just about the fine anymore. It was about the realization that his assumptions had been far off. Olivia Harris was no ordinary citizen. She was someone with power, influence, and the capability to change things. Things he never imagined she was capable of when he sentenced her that day. He couldn't help but wonder what it would have been like if he had known who she really was when she walked into his courtroom. The more Judge Dawson thought about Olivia Harris, the more his unease grew. The image of her calm, composed demeanor in court had replayed in his mind throughout the day. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something important. He had been so focused on his role in administering justice that he hadn't taken a moment to consider who the people in his courtroom really were. Later that afternoon, Dawson found himself in front of his television, the volume low as he watched a local news segment. The anchor was speaking about Harris's swearing-in ceremony, showing footage of her standing confidently on the steps of City Hall, taking her oath of office as the new police chief. The camera zoomed in on her face, graceful yet determined, her posture radiating authority. As the segment continued, Dawson listened to her words, her calm yet firm voice declaring that her mission was to strengthen the police department's relationship with the community. She spoke of her commitment to transparency, fairness, and accountability. Her message resonated with the audience, and Dawson felt an unexpected sense of awe. This was a leader who was not just taking charge, but one who had a vision for change he hadn't realized was coming. The shock didn't come just from her position, but from the way she carried herself. Olivia Harris was a woman who understood the weight of her role, the gravity of what she was about to undertake. She spoke with authority, but there was something else in her eyes, a quiet strength, a steady determination. Dawson's mind drifted back to the moment in court when he had dismissed her without a second thought. How could he have known? How could he have seen her as just another person? Just another case to process. He thought about the way she had accepted her fine with grace, without challenge or argument. It had seemed like nothing at the time. She hadn't made any waves, hadn't tried to push back. She had simply taken it. But now, as he watched her on the screen, he understood why. She wasn't there to argue with him. She was there to do her job, just as she was now doing for the city. Dawson felt a mixture of embarrassment and a strange sense of respect. He had written her off so easily. In his mind, she had been just another defendant, someone who had made a minor mistake. But he was beginning to realize that this woman, this new police chief, was far from ordinary. She had a vision for the future, a vision that would reshape the community in ways he hadn't yet imagined. The judge sat back in his chair, the weight of the moments settling in. He had been quick to judge, but now, for the first time, he was seeing Olivia Harris for who she truly was, and it made him uncomfortable in the best possible way. It had been a few weeks since Olivia Harris's appointment as police chief, and Judge Dawson found himself preparing for an upcoming city council meeting. His nerves were on edge, though he wasn't sure why. It was just another meeting. He had attended countless ones over the years, discussing new policies, local initiatives, and the occasional bit of legal red tape. But this time felt different. The fact that Olivia Harris would be there only added to the weight of the moment. The day of the meeting arrived, and as Dawson made his way into the conference room, he was greeted by the usual faces. But then he saw her, Olivia Harris, standing tall by the front, preparing to address the council. She exuded the same confident calm he had seen in her at the ceremony. Now, in the context of her new role, she seemed even more commanding, a stark contrast to the woman who had stepped into his courtroom weeks ago. Dawson tried to shake the awkward feeling that was creeping up on him. He couldn't escape the memory of the courtroom, of issuing that fine to the woman who now held the highest position in the local police force. His eyes kept returning to her, and he found himself trying to keep his focus on the task at hand, to avoid drawing attention to his lingering discomfort. As the meeting began, Harris took the floor to speak about her department's new initiatives, which included community outreach programs, efforts to improve transparency, and a new strategic plan to engage more with local leaders. Dawson listened, but his mind kept wandering back to their past interaction. He wondered if she remembered him, if she had thought about their brief encounter. Was she aware of the fine he had imposed on her? The meeting moved forward, with discussions on a variety of topics, but Dawson couldn't shake the tension. When his turn came to speak about a recent court initiative, he found his voice suddenly betraying him. His words were stiff, and his usual self-assurance was replaced with an uneasiness he hadn't expected. When the meeting finally ended, people began to gather their things. Harris stood by the door, speaking with a few colleagues. Dawson hesitated, wondering if he should approach her. Part of him wanted to apologize, but he wasn't sure how to start. Could he even bring it up? Would she want to talk about the fine? Before he could decide, Harris turned and made her way toward him. Her expression was warm but professional as she extended a hand. "Judge Dawson," she said, her voice even and polite. "It's good to see you again." Dawson's heart raced. He shook her hand, his grip a little firmer than he intended. "Yes, it's good to see you too, Chief Harris," he replied, his words feeling inadequate for the moment. She smiled, not with the hint of mockery he had half expected, but with genuine professionalism. "I'm looking forward to working together," she said, her eyes meeting his. The brief exchange was cordial, but Dawson couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and discomfort. He had avoided the topic of the fine, and she hadn't brought it up either. For a moment, he wondered if she had already put it behind her, but something told him that this encounter and their future ones would not be as simple as he had once thought. The days following the council meeting felt unusually quiet to Judge Dawson. Despite his attempts to focus on his cases, his mind kept drifting back to that brief conversation with Olivia Harris. The awkwardness lingered, but he couldn't quite figure out why it felt so significant. He had met countless public figures over the years, yet this encounter was different. There was an underlying tension, a feeling that things weren't as straightforward as they seemed. A week later, Dawson found himself in the courthouse hallway, preparing for a series of hearings. He had just finished a long morning of reviewing case files when he noticed a familiar face standing by the door. Olivia Harris. She was talking to another officer, her tone calm and steady, as she exchanged a few words about upcoming police initiatives. As she turned toward the courthouse's exit, her eyes met Dawson's, and for a brief moment, their gazes locked. Dawson was taken aback. He wasn't sure if he should approach her, or if he should simply let the moment pass. But before he could decide, Olivia walked up to him with the same composed professionalism he had seen from her in the past. "Judge Dawson," she greeted him, her voice warm but direct. "I wanted to take a moment to speak with you, if you have a minute." Dawson nodded, though a sense of nervousness fluttered in his chest. "Of course, Chief Harris. What's on your mind?" She motioned for him to step into a nearby office where they could talk privately. As Dawson followed her, he wondered what this conversation would be about. Was she going to address the fine? Or perhaps it was something related to the judicial system or the police department that required his attention. His mind raced with questions, though he tried to keep his expression neutral. Once they were settled, Harris folded her arms and regarded him thoughtfully. "I wanted to clear the air, Judge," she said, her tone still calm but with an edge of seriousness. "I know we didn't exactly have the chance to speak properly before, and I thought it might be best if we did." Dawson's stomach tightened. "About the fine?" he asked, unable to keep his curiosity in check. Harris nodded slowly, her expression unchanged. "Yes and no. I understand the need for law and order, and I accept the fine. It's part of the system, and I didn't expect special treatment. But I'd like you to understand something. I don't just hold this position for myself. It's bigger than me. It's about the people of this city and creating change. I'm here to work alongside you, and it's important that we start on the right foot." Her words hung in the air, heavy with significance. Dawson listened, taken aback by her clarity and determination. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't angry. She was simply explaining what had driven her to be where she was, and what her mission was for the future. He had expected a confrontation, but instead, he was faced with something else entirely. A professional who had risen to her position, not through favoritism or shortcuts, but through years of hard work and dedication. Her words were straightforward, yet they carried an undeniable power. "I see," Dawson replied quietly, a newfound respect forming in his mind. "I'm glad we could talk." She smiled, offering him a nod. "So am I, Judge. I'm looking forward to our future work together." Over the next few weeks, Judge Dawson found himself reflecting on his conversation with Chief Olivia Harris. It had been brief, yet it left a lasting impression. Her words were clear, professional, and filled with purpose. Unlike many others in positions of power, she didn't seem to see herself as above the law or the system. She understood its intricacies and challenges, but she had a vision for how it could evolve, how it could serve the community more effectively. Dawson couldn't help but feel a shift in his perspective. He had spent so many years behind the bench, upholding the law with a kind of detached authority, assuming he understood everything about the people who passed through his courtroom. But Harris had opened his eyes to something deeper. She wasn't just an enforcer of the law. She was someone who saw it as a tool for change, for building trust between people and institutions that had often been at odds. She had a vision for the future, one that Dawson realized could only work if both sides, law enforcement and the judicial system, worked together. As the days passed, Dawson began to notice subtle changes in his approach to his own work. He found himself considering the stories behind the faces that came before him, asking himself more questions than he ever had before. What had led this person to be in front of him today? What circumstances had shaped their lives? Was the system truly serving them, or was it just pushing them through a conveyor belt of punishment without offering any meaningful opportunity for reform? One morning, Dawson sat at his desk, going over a case involving a young man caught in a cycle of minor infractions. His first instinct had been to impose a fine and move on to the next case, but after his conversation with Harris, he paused. What if there was a better way? What if this young man needed help, guidance, resources, rather than just another penalty? Dawson picked up the phone and called the local community outreach program, something he hadn't considered before. Maybe, just maybe, this approach could change the outcome for someone who, like so many others, had been forgotten by the system. Later that week, Dawson attended another city council meeting. Harris was once again at the center of the discussion, presenting new initiatives for community engagement between the police force and local leaders. Dawson listened attentively, no longer just hearing the words, but truly considering their meaning. It was clear that Harris wasn't just aiming to change the police department. She was striving to create a shift in the community's relationship with law enforcement. And Dawson realized that, in his own way, he could be part of that change. It wasn't just about handing down sentences. It was about understanding the full picture, about ensuring that justice didn't simply mean punishment, but also support, empathy, and reform. For the first time in a long while, Judge Dawson felt like he was on the edge of something bigger than just the law. He was part of something that could change lives, and for the first time, he was truly ready to listen. Months passed, and the city began to feel the subtle yet powerful shift brought on by Chief Olivia Harris's leadership. The police department was no longer viewed merely as an enforcement entity, but as an active participant in the community's growth. Harris's initiatives, community policing, transparency in actions, outreach programs, slowly but surely began to build bridges between law enforcement and citizens. As the city embraced these changes, the collaboration between the police force and the judiciary started to strengthen. Judge Dawson, now more attuned to the deeper currents of justice, felt the effects of this transformation in his own courtroom. His decisions, once rigid and routine, began to incorporate a sense of empathy he hadn't thought to offer before. He no longer saw himself as just a figurehead of the law, but as a vital part of a larger system that had the power to heal rather than simply punish. One afternoon, Dawson found himself reviewing the case of a repeat offender, a young woman, barely in her 20s, who had been arrested multiple times for petty theft and other minor charges. In the past, he would have sentenced her to a fine or brief jail time, following protocol without hesitation. But this time, something in his approach had changed. He recalled a conversation he had with Olivia Harris a few weeks ago, where she had spoken about rehabilitation and providing people with the tools to succeed, not just penalizing them for their mistakes. He had attended one of her department's community workshops, where local officers had worked alongside social workers and counselors to provide resources for people who had fallen into cycles of criminal behavior. The initiative focused on offering young people, especially those in underserved neighborhoods, opportunities to learn new skills, find stable jobs, and receive counseling for deeper issues, such as addiction and trauma. Sitting at his desk, Dawson stared at the young woman's case file. Her history was familiar, a series of poor choices made under circumstances he knew too well. He made a decision. Instead of another fine or incarceration, he would direct her toward a rehabilitation program. It was not a soft choice, but a fair one, giving her a chance to change her trajectory, a chance that, under his previous mindset, he might have dismissed. Later that week, Dawson found himself in another meeting with Chief Harris. The city was celebrating the success of a new community policing initiative that had reduced local crime rates and increased cooperation between the police and the neighborhoods they served. Harris's pride was evident, but so was her humility. She wasn't looking for applause. She was focused on the next step, the next challenge. As they spoke, Dawson felt a deep sense of connection to the work she was doing. He realized that, in a small but significant way, he had become part of the change too. His approach to the law had evolved, not through a grand gesture, but through consistent, thoughtful action. The shift was subtle, but it was there. The relationship between the police department and the judiciary had grown stronger, more cooperative, less about division and more about mutual respect. As he looked at Olivia Harris, now with a full understanding of her mission, Dawson knew they were building something lasting. Something that would change not just the city, but the lives of those who lived within it. They were ushering in a new era of justice, one where fairness was rooted in understanding, and where every person had the opportunity to rebuild, not just face consequences. For Judge Dawson, it had all come full circle. The fine he had once imposed on Olivia Harris had been a small part of a much larger story, one he was now ready to continue, with a new sense of purpose.